Namaskar. Welcome to this session. We are considering the Chittaparikarma and therein the Vishayavati pravrutti of the senses. Patanjali has this unique terminology and concept called Vishayavati pravrutti. Usually the senses are supposed to be having Vaishayik pravrutti. So our senses are under the influence and gravity and their functional process, which is Vaishayik vritti of the senses. So they are going after their objects. They will be hunting their objects. They will be haunted by their objects. That is called Vaishayika pravrutti. But here it is Vishayavati pravrutti. So, as I said, this has been translated as higher sensory activity. Higher sensory activity is a vague expression of what is being mentioned here. So it is to be seen like this. The senses work under influence of what? On one side it is objects which influence the senses. But more importantly, it is on the other side the samskars of the citta. They will regulate the sensory functions. Like the way a yogi or saintly person sights an object or a situation or a scenario, and a common man sights the same scenario. On the other hand, a person who is under infatuation, who is crazy for that object, so the senses would work differently. It is because the underlying citta and underlying citta samskars. Therefore, a person who is philosophically evolved in consciousness and in thought process and in conduct of life, his senses would be differently perceiving the objects, sensing the objects, receiving the objects. While on the other hand, who is very tamasic person, rajasic person, who is under some obsessions of exuberance of rajoguna and tamoguna, will be differently taking the experience of the same object. So, those who are evolved in consciousness, their senses would be more reformed. And those who are not evolved in consciousness, their senses would work crazily. So this is well known to everyone, and one can imagine here. So one thing is that one should evolve the level of consciousness by the yogic regimen of satsanga, sadhana sanga, shastra sanga, by inculcating values of yagn, dhana, tapas, by sattvic, ahar, viha, achar, vichar. So one will be able to evolve the consciousness. Now this needs no explanation, that the senses conduct themselves corresponding to the level of consciousness, culture of consciousness. If the person is very mean in consciousness levels, very low, very mean in consciousness levels, perhaps someone can be a subhuman human being. In human beings, we have subhuman human beings. Average human beings are far better than these subhuman human beings. We don't have to consider subhuman means some animals and creatures and birds, etc. But we can get even subhuman human beings who are below the average human being, conduct of average human being. So they would be receiving the same object, same situation, same scenario, same circumstance, same stimuli differently. And therefore, we are often told about in satsanga and in our scriptures, certain statements are there. Vishnumayam idam jagat, Vasudevam idam sarvam, Ishavasyam idam sarvam, Sarvam khalvidam brahma. So, these mentions of the scriptures, they can evolve the plane of consciousness by satsanga, sadhana sangha, shastra sangha. So we can understand the sensory acts will be definitely superior sensory acts, or what is called in English or translated into English while dealing with this sutra as higher sensory activity. A saintly person, a yogi, a self-realized person, God-realized person, his senses would be definitely having a higher sensory activity. And there we understand we need to evolve our culture, our conduct, our achar, vichar, ahar, vihar, and then the whole regimen which I have been repeatedly telling you about. So that will contribute. So the matter of consciousness, matter of chitta itself is evolved. If the matter of chitta itself is evolved, the senses which are under the governance of it would certainly work differently, and that is higher sensory activity. So now what we are understanding here is by yoga technology. Yoga technology significantly contributes even to our given state of consciousness, like you and me. We know our given state of consciousness, so we know our sensory culture, our sensory tendencies, our sensory behavior, our sensory impulses. So with that still there, yet yoga, the technology of yoga, the pratyahara technology, pratyahara is philosophy, and if you inculcate philosophy, then the senses are going to conduct themselves on a very evolved plane. But there is something in yoga technology called sensely act. And with the given level of consciousness, state of consciousness, caliber of consciousness, culture of consciousness, the sensely acts can really come handy. And therefore, if you recall, during the education, this aspect was touched, and I would request you to go back to that session where we were dealing with sensely acts. Now, the sensely acts, this technology has come from pratyahara. Now, generally, nobody knows what is sadhana for pratyahara. They think that pratyahara happens. Now, pratyahara is a condition where the indriyas don't behave under the whims of chitta or psyche or tendencies or vasanas or mind, but the senses become cittaswarupanukara. The senses embrace the essential nature or substantive nature of the chitta. Now, substantive nature of the chitta, as a substance, the chitta is sattvic. It's called buddhisattva. And in pratyahara, the senses go under the governance of cittaswarupa. While for you and me, the senses are under the governance of chitta, chaitik vasanas, chaitik vikara, chaitik vikruti, our likes, dislikes, love, loath, hate, attachment, avidyadi kleshas, kama krodhadi shadripus. So our chitta is tainted, indented. There are indentations on the chitta. There is taint and there is influence, there is shadow of our vasanas, our tendencies. And under that chitta, the senses work. But in yoga, in yogic process, there is component of pratyahara coming up. And in that pratyahara, the senses adhere to cittaswarupa. Cittaswarupanukara ivai indriyanam pratyaharaha. Svavishaya asamprayoge cittaswarupanukara ivai indriyanam pratyaharaha. So under pratyahara gravity, basically the senses depart from usual attachment and their influence of vishayas. So if you look into the definition of pratyahara, svavishaya asamprayoge, disjunction from their own objects. The senses are their own objects, which you are well aware, shabda, sparsha, rupa, rasa, gandha, of the nature of sound, of the nature of touch, of the nature of form, color, shape, of the nature of taste, of the nature of odor, fragrance, smell. So these are their objects. In Pratyahara, what happens? The senses are weaned away, they are disengaged with their objects. The engagement is such that they are disengaged from the objects. Like you and me can also experience that when we are in sublime state of mind, sublimated mind, then the senses lose their craze, usual craze, and they depart. And they don't want to be going towards their objects. They go inwardly. The senses go inwardly when the mind is sublimated. And then, if in case of yoga and with yoga technology, you can take the senses towards the substantive form of the citta, which is sattvic. So with that, the senses will be away from their objects. That is svavishaya asamprayogaha. So there will be non-contact with their own objects. The senses find an internal object which is sublime, which is transcendent. So that is the pratyaharic technique. And with that, our senses would be doing an unusual activity when the senses are drawn inwards. And in yoga, we are drawn inwards, we draw the senses inwardly. And that's why yogic practices are also called as closed eyes practices. The closed eyes practices, the closed eyes, this predicate is upalakshana. Even our ears are not going to external sounds. Our gustatory organ is not going to external stimuli. Nostrils, olfactory organ is not going to external stimuli. They are all drawn inwards. And they all become chaitik organs. They all become organs of chitta, rather than remaining as jnanendriyas and bhogendriyas. They are not indriyas for jnana of the form of shabda, sparsha, rupa, rasa, gandha. but they have a locus within. All the 5 sense organs become one chaitic organ. They become organ of wisdom in yoga. And when they become organ of wisdom, there is a unique activity of senses. Eyes are not going to look something, ears are not going to hear something, but they are trying to know something. What eyes try to know, ears try to know the same. Nostrils or the nose tries to know the same. The tongue tries to know the same. Skin tries to know the same. So they lose their classification as visual organ, auditory organ, olfactory organ, tactile organ, gustatory organ. So they lose their status. So watch in your yoga, when you are doing your asanas or even pranayam, your eyes are not trying to see something. Eyes are trying to know something. And what they try to know something is the same what ears try to know, nostrils try to know, your skin tries to know, your gustatory organ tries to know. So they will be knowing, they will be going after one and same object, which is jnana, which is wisdom. They don't play 5 kinds of activities which are their functional activities, functional form. That's called grahana rupa. In Patanjali's treatise, later we'll be coming to investigate the senses. So they have 5 forms, and we know the only functional form. Eyes means see, ear means hear, nose means smell, and the tongue means taste, and skin means touch. So we know what are their functions. These are their functional roles whereby they become visual organ, auditory organ, olfactory organ, gustatory organ, tactile organ. But in the process of asanas, when you do yogasanas, they all become wisdom organs, they become really jnanendriyas. This precept also has come during our delineation earlier. And this is a pratyaharic component to first wean them away from their objects, and they are given some internal engagement. And their internal engagement is to gain knowledge, wisdom of the internal realm. So they are disengaged from external objects. Eyes have nothing to see inside. Ears have nothing to hear inside. The nose or nostrils have nothing to smell inside. Our tongue doesn't have anything to taste inside. Now what are they doing? The skin has nothing to touch inside. Then what are they doing? They really become jnanendriyas in yoga. Otherwise they are vishayendriyas in vyuthana, in outgoing state. But they are wrongly called as cognitive organs or jnanendriyas. They get, of course, jnana, but that's called vaishayika jnana. And vaishayika jnana is not really jnana. Adhyatma jnana is only jnana. If you recall this precept which was given earlier, that adhyatma jnana is only jnana, rest all is ajnana according to Bhagavad Gita. Adhyatma jnana nityatvam tattva jnanartha darshanam etad jnanam iti proktam ajnanam yadado anyatha. So now they are working as organs of Shabda Sparsha Rupa Rasa Gandha. In the internal realm, they don't have to do that. So they have different engagement in the internal realm, and that is that they are jnanendriyas, they are wisdomendriyas, they are organs of wisdom. So that is the pratyaharic component. So Pratyahara Sutra starts with Swa Vishay Asamprayogaha. So that is actualized even in your asanas. When you are doing your asana, your pranayam, eyes are not seeing visual object. The ears are not hearing auditory objects. The nostrils are not trying to know the smell object, olfactory object. So also the tongue gustatory object, and the skin tactile object. Then what objects do they have inside? So inside they don't have these 5 kinds of objects. That is the pratyaharic component. So now our consciousness level is not really changed. We are working on same consciousness level. It is not that we have become saints, but we become saintly. We can become saintly in our yoga. So when we become saintly, the senses have unique role, which is pratyaharic component. And then they will be, the more you get internalized, the more you proceed in the internal realms, and when you go for those necessary transformations, then it is heading towards the other component of pratyahara, which is citta swarupanukara aspect of indriyas. The more you go in, and it's quite an essential state of yoga, which we will get during our practice session, to whatever deservations and caliber, qualification, empowerment that we have. So our citta has not really substantively changed. It is a temporary change with one session of practice, with that session of practice. But with a regular practice, we will be slowly lifting our plane of consciousness. Anyway, the plane of consciousness not being changed, the senses can work differently, in more sublime way, in more graduated way, in a transcendent way. It is because of pratyaharic component in our asana, pranayam, or whatever japa, dhana that one might be able to carry out successfully. So, here you should bring in mind the sensely acts out of Ashtadasha Mahakriyas. And there you will get to know some technology. Now, in order to have little orientation to this technology, something can be said here, which the student of yoga later, if not sooner, will be developing this observation. The common man is not at all stimulated to this observation. But a student of yoga, if not sooner, later, definitely will have this. Now, listen to few questions. How the senses work, have potentials to work differently. Our senses are not mechanical devices. Like camera will be taking photograph of unsightly to beautiful, bewitching object. Being an inert apparatus, it doesn't distinguish. It doesn't have likes and dislikes like we have. We won't like to look at unsightly face, and we would be bewitched to look at beautiful face. This is not the case of camera. The camera will be almost like evil-minded person and doesn't have this basis for distinction. But when it comes to human beings, we know the difference. Now, we need to carry out certain observations, and that's why I'm giving you few questions with reference to some of the senses. When you are looking at a enticing, bewitching object. How do you look at it? Now the object is in a close proximity, like it is close up to your eyes. How do you look at it? Say a beautiful fresh flower. How do you look at it? Which is really bewitching you. How do you look at it? The same flower at a distance with a telescopic view. How do you watch it? So beauty close up, beauty at a distance, telescopic view. How will you look at it? Then how do you look at unsightly object or an average normal object for which you don't have to have any aversion? The eyes work differently. We are not really observing and studying our own eyes. How do we look at object that is hated and object that is bewitching? Our sense act of eyes itself will be different. Not only that, the influence of that on the mind will be different. It is obviously different. When you are sighted unsightly object, you are vexed, you are tormented, the aversions are bubbles up. If you have seen a bewitching object, then delusion overtakes your mind. So mind will be infested with delusion. So that's one thing, but the very act of the eyes is different. So sometimes we have to carry out this observation as students of yoga. How do we look at close-up beauty and a distant beauty? And now suppose it's that flower, it's orchards of that flower. It is spreading of to some hundreds or thousands of meters. You take a panoramic view. So how do you sight that? Same flower close up, same flower at a distance, same flower in orchards set up, where you have many flowers extending from right side of you to left side of you and to far side of you. Then how do you sight? How do you look? We know that the focusing muscles of the eyes would work differently. And because of that, even our act of the visual organ would be different. How do we look at an object that is neither liked nor disliked? It's a different act of eyes. How do you look at a very aversive object, hated object, for which you have an enormous loath and aversion? How do you look at it? It's a different act. So this study will tell you that eyes can work differently. Eyes do work differently with reference to objects. Liked object, disliked object, loved object, loathed object. Object close to your eyes and at a distance. So we have different functions of the eyes. So with regard to ears, it is similarly that if you are listening to gossip which interests you, how do the ears work? You are interested in that gossip, you are interested in that subject matter of gossip, then how do you hear? Now sometimes it is gossip that you don't want to hear, yet it falls on your ears. But how do you hear? There's a big difference between hearing the gossip that you want to hear and the gospel that you want to hear. These are two different auditory acts. This goes unnoticed. Nobody takes this into account. So wanted gossip and wanted gospel. Keen about that gossip and keen about that gospel. Your hearing act changes. So a student of yoga is expected to be going through this objective process of understanding sensory acts with respect to your state of your mind, culture of the mind. You have some likes and some dislikes, you have some loves and some loathes with respect to all the five objects of the five senses. How do we really carry out that act? So all the five senses have their activities, but they have their objects which are disliked and liked, very much disliked to very much liked, or anything in between that, every degree in between that. The sensory acts are different. Now in yoga, you have a field where you don't have likes and dislikes, yet you see, yet you hear. There are no visual objects, yet you see. There are no auditory objects, yet you hear in the internal realm, because they become wisdom organs. So they have totally a different function in yoga. As I said just now, eyes are not visual organs when they are have gone in. Closed eyes practices means you are not trying to get any visual stimuli from outside, but there is some engagement to the eyes in the internal realm. This is not necessarily a visual object inside. As I said, it's a wisdom object. So they have a different role in yoga. With swa-vishaya asamprayoga, it's not that they are having their casual leave or privileged leave and they don't do anything. They do something. So we have to understand what do they do. And if I tell you to go back to the sensely acts which were discussed on earlier occasion, then you will know that how you can have different mind matter behind your asanas. So in sensely acts, you have acts based on your awareness confined to a part of the organ. So with reference to eyes, there are outer eyelid awareness, inner eye awareness, bottom eye awareness, upper eye awareness, center eye awareness. With respect to ears, you have hind ear awareness, fore ear awareness, bottom ear awareness, top ear awareness, and center ear awareness. So your auditory culture, visual culture will be totally different. So these are all pratyaharic components to sublimate your mind and engage your senses in different ways with your chitta. And that is a kind of vishayavati pravrutti at our level. So another thing, that we start developing a skill in sensely acts and sensory acts, whereby our mind is really protected. See, otherwise the mind is vulnerable to fall prey to stimuli. So sometimes ignoble object comes in front of your eyes. Your mind is disturbed. Ignoble auditory object comes to your ears. Then your mind is disturbed. So mind is vulnerable to these sensory acts. But if you have carried out some practices with respect to sensely acts, then let me tell you an interesting phenomenon, that when the object is not noble, you will have the visual perception which will not disturb your mind. Object not noble will not remain not noble and it will be perceived. Or the object which is ignoble can even become to some extent noble because of the influence of philosophy. Vishnumayam idam jagata, Vasudevam idam sarvam, sarvam khalvidam brahma. So the object might be ignoble, but the mind doesn't get a mutiny, or perhaps it will be seen as noble. Object is otherwise generally ignoble object, but it will be seen as noble because Vishnumayam idam jagata. When the object is not sublime, like in photography, you have filters to use. So you will be given a filter. Nobility filter to your eyes will set aside any ignoble radiations from the objects, and you will get noble radiation. And therefore the mind will not be spoiled. Otherwise our mind is in a good condition, but then it is spoiled by what we hear, what we see, what our five senses get, the objects, the stimuli, that spoils our mind. But then the sensely act or pratyaharic acts, when sufficiently developed, then you get filters. And they will filter the object. They will filter out the ignoble aspects from object, and then it will be taken not being ignoble. Then the mind has a different reaction to it. So just as a professional camera photographer has so many filters, so many lenses for so many effects, different effects. So you develop that in your eyes, you develop that in your ears. And therefore, even if the thing is ignoble, it will not be seen and taken as ignoble, will not be received as ignoble. So that's the endowment, that's a bounty. If you have heard something which is something that would generally infuriate you, exasperate you, but with that filter, that will be set aside. And then you will be having the audition without such factors which can spoil your mind state. So the ears also get filters, eyes also get filters. All the sense organs get a filter, so they are able to carry out their function on a superior plane. See, even in case of photography, sometimes the photographers, when they are taking a photograph of a thing which is not so beautiful, or person who is not so beautiful, they will give you a photograph as if it is really bewitchingly beautiful. So actually the person is not so beautiful, but photographers can do something whereby they will photograph in such a way and give you a print of it in such a way that the person seems to be bewitchingly beautiful. They have these skills. Whereas the amateur person takes a photograph, beautiful object, beautiful person photographed, the object is not that much beautiful, as much as the face value of the face value of that object is. So there is a great depreciation of 30, 40, 50, 60%. That's what happens to amateurs and amateur cameras. But professional people, professional cameras have enormous kind of endowments. So here, with sensely acts, you will be developing that skill of a photographer who gives you a print of a face which is 10 times beautiful than actual face. And therefore your mind will be definitely happier and delighted, and there will be gratification. So that's a bit about it. Now going to the textual purport of this. Vyasa has mentioned certain esoteric aspects which you and me have to just believe. For us to experience that will be a long journey, because that expects that one becomes a yogi. So he mentions certain esoteric aspects of the sensory acts, and there is something called as divya vishayas. We have laukika shabda sparsha rupa rasa vishayas, but there are alaukika shabda sparsha rupa rasa vishayas which are available for a yogi. We cannot be even imagining, but we will have to believe that such objects are there. They are glorious objects of the form of shabda, sparsha, rupa, rasa, gandha. They are called heavenly objects, swargiya vishayas. And in yoga you have this kind of super sensory act. And then he mentions certain these esoteric aspects by dharana on nasagra. Nasagra is a part of the organ, the olfactory organ. One gets divya, paralaukika, alaukika, swargiya smell perception, gandham, divya gandham. That's called divya gandha perception. That is called gandha pravrutti technically. Technically it is called gandha pravrutti. When you are getting celestial smell which is not available in this terrestrial world, but it is heavenly smell, then that is called gandha pravrutti, and that gandha pravrutti really sublimates your mind. It takes the mind on a higher plane. Then he says, jivha gre, the tip of the tongue, there is rasa samvita. Rasa samvita, the celestial taste, celestial rasa samvedana, and that is called rasa pravrutti technically. Then talu madhye divya rupam. Talu means the source of the tongue. There divya rupa jnanam. And in the middle part of the tongue there is sparsha jnana. Sparsha samvit or sparsha pravrutti. And jivha mula divya shabda jnanam. That is called shabda samvit. So the tongue is such a major organ. We only know the tongue has taste buds, but we also know that the goddess of wisdom resides in the tongue. The Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom, is in the tongue. Wisdom is will be manifesting from one's oral organ, oration. And that's why the Saraswati is said to be presiding deity over the vocal organ, oral organ, and the tongue there. So the tongue gives most of the celestial sensations. It is not only a gustatory organ. The tongue, in its esoteric status or aspects, is not merely a gustatory organ, but it almost gives those divya pravrutis which we just now considered. So when such pravrutis are available for a yogi, the chitta becomes heavenly steady, sublime and steady, sublime and serene, sublime and quiet. And the sublimity is really very, very, very lofty. Not the sublimation that you get in the world by going to Switzerland and going to Kashmir and some beautiful natural resorts. But this is sublimity of heavenly caliber. And then chitta becomes quiet, chitta becomes settled, chitta becomes transcendent, the chitta becomes pure, pious, sanct, sublimated, and then you will start getting yathartha jnanam. And all the doubts with respect to the knowledge, sensory knowledge, will come to an end. So, major purport of this sutra is for this divya shabda pravruti, sparsha pravruti, rupa pravruti, rasa pravruti, gandha pravruti, and there is nothing in the eyes for that. Either there is something in the nose or something in the tongue, and the tongue scores over the nose. The most of the pravrutis are in the mouth region, in the parts of the tongue. So that is something that is about esoteric physiology of the tongue. Because if Saraswati has opted to be in the tongue, naturally the tongue must have great potentials. Now our tongue, which is so sunk in the mire of vasanas, it becomes insignificant. Not only insignificant, it becomes an antagonizer to spiritual process. It becomes alien for spiritual process. The tongue is a major alien force. Its crazes are major alien forces for spiritual pursuit. So Vyasa tells us here that at least one small part of this matter which has been spoken of, if one part of it, 0.01% of it is really experienced, then it will boost your shraddha, your faith about yogic postulations, and then your progress in yoga also will be rapidified. Because if we don't progress in yoga, we don't have to blame other things, obstacles, our social commitments, our family conditions. We have to blame our shraddha. When the shraddha is strong, nothing can overpower it. So the obstacles of yoga will just fall aside. They will fall out like dry leaves fall off the tree. Then you don't have to point out at someone and something which is obstacle to your yoga. So the primary purport, for which I have not devoted much time, because it is esoteric, that is what is vishayavati pravrutti textually. And then that is a booster to vairagya, that is booster to abhyasa, and therefore booster to yoga. So that is the third option in the realm of senses, and more particularly about the esoteric aspects of the senses. So with that, we will be ending the delineation on this, the third measure for Chitta Prasadanam, which is Vishayavati va pravrittir utpannaha. See, the sutra says pravrittihi utpanna. These are the pravrittis. Shabda pravritti, rasa, sparsha pravritti, rupa pravritti, rasa pravritti, gandha pravritti, which Vyasa has explained, which in the tail piece of my explanation I introduced you to the esoteric aspects. So, Vishayavati va pravritti utpannaha manasaha sthiti nibandhani. So that becomes sthiti nibandhaka for the mind, steadiness of the mind, sublimation of the mind. Now we go to next Chitta Prasadana measure, but that is next time. That is by a sutra, Vishokava Jyotishmati. But that is in the next session. Namaskar, all of you.